The smell of fresh coffee filled my kitchen that morning, the same smell that had once meant comfort when Richard was alive sitting across from me with his newspaper. Now the chair beside me was empty, and the silence was broken only by my son's voice. "Mom, you need to stop holding on to everything. It's time to sign the inheritance over to me." His wife, one hand resting on her swollen belly, leaned in with that practiced smile. "It's for the baby, Eleanor. Stress isn't good for either of us." I tightened my grip on the warm mug, the bitterness of the coffee rising in my throat as the words sank in. My own son. The boy I had raised through scraped knees and sleepless nights, now looking at me as if I were nothing more than a burden standing in his way. He walked in with his phone in one hand, setting it down as if this were still his house. At 34, my son had grown into a man with sharp shoulders and a quicker temper than he used to show me. Behind him came Madison, 7 months pregnant, lowering herself carefully into one of the kitchen chairs. She smiled softly at me, but there was a look in her eyes that felt rehearsed, as if she were waiting for a cue. "Mom," Daniel said, not bothering with good morning, not even glancing at the plate of food I had just set out. He sat across from me, leaning forward on his elbows. "I think it's time we talk about the inheritance." I stopped in the middle of buttering my toast. The knife hovered in the air, dripping a little butter back onto the plate. "The inheritance," I asked, my voice steady, though my heart gave a painful twist. He nodded, his jaw set like he'd practiced this conversation in his head. "It makes sense, Mom. You should transfer everything into my name now. The accounts, the deed. I'll take care of it all. That way it's safe and you don't have to worry about anything." Madison shifted, resting a protective hand on her belly. Her other hand touched Daniel's arm lightly, encouraging him. "It's really what's best for the baby," she added softly, her voice warm, but her eyes watchful. The words hung in the air like smoke I couldn't clear. I set the knife down slowly, my fingers tightening around my coffee cup. Richard's face flashed in my mind the last time I saw him before the heart attack. His hand in mine. His voice steady as he told me everything would be okay. We had spent decades saving, planning, making sure I would be secure no matter what. He wanted me safe, not cornered in my own kitchen by my only son. "Daniel," I said carefully, "your father worked hard for what we had. He made sure I would be taken care of. It's not something to be passed around like it's nothing." He exhaled, impatient, running a hand through his hair. "Mom, you don't understand. Times are different. You shouldn't be dealing with bills and paperwork at your age. Let me do it. Madison and we can manage it better. It's not like you need it all. We're starting a family. Don't you want to see us safe?" The casual cruelty in his words stunned me. Not like you need it all, as if my years, my sacrifices, my memories could be boiled down to numbers on paper. My throat tightened, but I refused to let him see me break. Madison spoke again, her voice lilting, almost soothing. "Think about it, Eleanor. Less stress for you. More stability for us. The doctor keeps telling me stress is dangerous, and right now it just feels like too many things are up in the air. This would make everything easier." I stared at her hand, stroking her stomach, the way she used that unborn child as a shield, a reason for everything. It wasn't the baby asking for this. It was her. And Daniel was falling in line behind her without question. For a moment, silence pressed in on the three of us. I could hear the faint tick of the clock above the fridge, the creak of the house settling. I lifted my coffee, taking a long sip. The bitterness coated my tongue, grounding me. Finally, I placed the cup down and looked straight at my son. "No," I said simply. His eyes flicked to Madison, who gave a small shrug, her lips pressing into a polite smile. She looked satisfied, as if she expected this answer, and already had another plan ready. Daniel leaned back, exhaling heavily through his nose. He didn't argue, not yet, but the tension clung to the air like static before a storm. I picked up my toast again, spreading the butter with slow, deliberate strokes. My hands were steady, even if my heart wasn't. Inside, I felt the sharp sting of betrayal. My own son, the boy I had rocked to sleep, the teenager I had stayed up waiting for past curfew, the man I thought I had raised with decency, now sat across from me, seeing me not as his mother, but as a means to an end. We ate in silence after that, forks scraping softly against plates, Madison occasionally glancing at Daniel for reassurance. The house felt colder than it had a moment before, as if the warmth had been stripped away with a single conversation. I cleared my plate, rinsed it in the sink, my back to them. My reflection in the window looked older, lonelier. I held onto the edge of the counter, letting the hurt settle deep in my chest. They thought they could push me aside with calm voices and careful words. I carried my cup of coffee back to the table, sat down, and took another sip. My refusal still hung in the air, firm and unyielding. Daniel drummed his fingers once against the table, then grabbed his phone, scrolling like the matter was closed for now. Madison smoothed her dress over her belly and smiled faintly, as if she had already won something. The morning sun shifted, casting a colder light across the room. I wrapped my hands tighter around my coffee cup, letting the warmth seep into my palms. I knew this wasn't the end of the conversation. It was only the beginning. The next few days blurred together in a way that left me uneasy, like each morning was an echo of the one before it. Daniel seemed to make a point of stopping by whenever Madison wanted him to, and the subject was always the same. He would sit down at the kitchen table, or lean against the doorway while I was folding laundry or watering the plants, his tone rehearsed but careful, carrying that false edge of concern. "Mom, you really shouldn't be handling all the bills and accounts anymore," he'd say, his voice pitched softer than usual. "It's too much stress for you. Let me manage them. I'll make sure everything runs smoothly." The words were framed like kindness, but underneath I heard the pressure, the insistence. I would give him a small smile, shake my head, and return to whatever I was doing. But each time I felt something chip away a little deeper. Madison would add her voice when she thought I was wavering, gentle and sweet on the surface. One evening, as I cleared the plates after dinner, she rubbed her belly and said, "Eleanor, you know how much stability matters right now. The baby needs calm, not uncertainty. We just want to prepare the right way." Her tone was soft, almost pleading, but her eyes held no plea. They were firm, steady, as if she were daring me to disagree. I rinsed the dishes in silence, the sound of running water filling the space between us. At night, lying in my bed, I would think of Richard. We had spent 30 years side by side, working long hours, clipping coupons, sacrificing vacations so we could build something lasting. By the time he passed in 2018, we had nearly $850,000 between the house, the retirement accounts, and his life insurance. He had looked me in the eye more than once and said, "This will keep you safe, Ellie. No matter what happens, you'll be okay." And yet here I was, 4 years later, my own son circling me like a wolf, dressed in concern, trying to convince me that what was mine should already belong to him. I thought of the nights Richard spent poring over bank statements at the kitchen table, of how proud he had been when we made the final mortgage payment. If he could see this now, I wondered what he would think of Daniel's urgency, of Madison's quiet maneuvering. One morning, Daniel showed up while I was having coffee on the porch. He sat down beside me, spreading out a few brochures I hadn't asked for. Investment firms' housing options, all bright and glossy. "Mom, this isn't about control," he insisted. "It's about planning. Madison and I. We just don't want you burdened with this stuff anymore. Let us take care of it." I flipped one of the pages, slowly looking at the photos of smiling seniors and happy families, and felt my throat tighten. Planning. I repeated, handing the paper back to him. "Your father and I already did the planning. That's why you're not the one worrying about how to pay for my roof repairs or doctor visits." "I am..." His mouth tightened. "You don't have to make this harder than it is. Harder. As if my resistance was the problem, not his persistence." I picked up my mug, took a sip of coffee, and said nothing. By the 4th time he raised the subject, something in his eyes had shifted. It wasn't just him echoing Madison's lines anymore. He leaned forward across the table, his voice firmer, heavier. "Mom, you can't use this money forever. It has to work for the family, for me, for my child. Don't you see? It makes sense for me to have control now. You're set. You'll be fine. There it was. Not Madison's voice through him. His own. Greed creeping into the edges of his words. My heart twisted at the sound because I had feared it and now I heard it clear. I looked at him carefully, searching for the boy I had raised, the boy who once hugged me after school with sticky hands and a crooked smile. I wanted to find that boy somewhere in his face, but all I saw was a man eager to reach into my future and pull it into his hands. The living room felt smaller as silence settled. Madison sat nearby, one hand on her stomach, smiling faintly as though the conversation were drifting in exactly the direction she wanted. I pressed my palm flat against the table, grounding myself. "Daniel," I said quietly, "I'm not signing anything. Not now, not ever. Your father didn't leave this so you could take it early. He left it so I would have peace." For a moment, he held my gaze, his jaw clenching. Then he leaned back, exhaling sharply through his nose. Madison smoothed the front of her dress and looked away, but I caught the curve of her smile. I felt the ache of betrayal settle deeper in my chest. Daniel wasn't just parroting his wife anymore. He was beginning to believe it, beginning to hunger for it himself. That realization hurt more than any words spoken aloud. I stacked the empty plates quietly, carried them to the sink, and let the warm water run over my hands longer than necessary. Behind me, Daniel muttered something about heading out, his voice clipped, and Madison rose slowly, touching his arm. The sound of the front door closing left me alone in the kitchen, water still streaming the house too quiet. I gripped the edge of the sink, letting the truth press heavy on me. My son wanted my inheritance. And worse, he was starting to believe it was already his. It started small, almost so subtle I thought I imagined it. One afternoon, while dusting the living room, I noticed the framed photo from my wedding was gone from the mantel. In its place sat a wide canvas print of pastel flowers, the kind you might see in a hotel lobby. I stood there for a long moment, cloth in hand, trying to understand how something so precious could vanish overnight. A day later, the portrait of Daniel as a boy standing by the lake with his first fishing rod was no longer hanging in the hallway. Instead, there was a generic landscape of mountains we had never visited. The house I had filled with memories was shifting under my feet, piece by piece, being repainted into something unrecognizable. When I asked, Daniel shrugged. "It brightens the place up, Mom. It's good for Madison, especially now. She needs calm. You understand. I wanted to argue that calm didn't come from removing history, that a brighter house meant nothing if the heart of it was stripped bare. But the words caught in my throat. I swallowed them down and let the silence stand between us. Later that week, I came down to the garage looking for a serving platter I only used on holidays. The light bulb flickered as I pulled the chain, revealing boxes stacked neatly against the wall. My handwriting stared back at me. Wedding china, family albums, Richard's things. The cedar chest Richard had built with his own hands sat shoved into a corner, a thin layer of dust dulling its carved surface. I knelt down, running my fingers along the grooves of his work. My throat ached as I lifted the lid, the scent of cedar and time rushing up at me. Inside were photo albums, his old law journals, the watch he wore every day until the day he collapsed. I picked up one photograph. Richard in his suit, smiling, his arm draped around me on a beach trip we'd taken the year before Daniel was born. My vision blurred as I traced the edge of his face with my thumb. Memories flooded me, late nights with Richard at the dining table, our laughter when Daniel was little, the way Richard always insisted on taking the photo even when I felt tired. These weren't just things. They were our life. And now they were boxed away like clutter hidden out of sight. I sat on the cold cement floor for a long time, holding that photograph, feeling both comforted and erased. Comforted by the reminder of love that had carried me through decades, erased by the way it had been shoved aside without a word. The next morning, as I walked through the dining room, I noticed the chandelier bulbs had been swapped out. The warm glow that once made dinners feel intimate was replaced by a harsher white light. On the table sat a vase filled with faux eucalyptus, the kind sold at chain stores. My china cabinet had been pushed back a few inches, leaving space for Madison's new decorative pieces. Sterile, polished, impersonal. She looked up when she saw me notice. "Don't you think it feels fresher this way?" "Lighter," she asked, her tone pleasant, but her smile too tight. I forced a nod. "It's different." Inside, though, I felt a knot of grief tighten. Each change whispered the same message: you don't belong here anymore. That evening, while Madison hummed to herself in the kitchen, I retreated to my bedroom. Even there, things felt shifted. The quilt I always draped across the end of the bed was missing. I found it folded neatly in the hall closet behind a stack of new linens that weren't mine. I closed the closet door slowly, my reflection in the mirror catching the sag of my shoulders. I had spent decades creating a home where Daniel would always feel welcome, where our memories lived in every frame, every dish, every corner. And now, piece by piece, Madison was erasing me. Standing in that dim hallway, I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit until then. This wasn't redecorating. It wasn't about making the house brighter or calmer. It was a rehearsal for a house without me in it. The air felt heavier, and I pressed my hand against the wall for balance. Richard's face flashed again in my mind, steady and kind, reminding me of the promises he made when he worked late nights, when we skipped vacations, when we paid off that mortgage $1 at a time. I whispered to myself, "They're trying to write me out." The words sounded strange aloud, but true. I went back to the garage, pulled the photograph of Richard from the cedar chest, and held it to my chest as I sat in the quiet. The dust in the air caught the weak bulb light, floating like tiny reminders that time never stopped moving, even when you wished it would. It was in that moment, staring at the face of the man who had built this life with me, that I felt the deepest ache yet. Not because the objects were gone from their places, but because the message was clear. I was being erased from my own home. And for the first time I couldn't shake the fear that I might not be able to stop it. The front porch creaked as I settled into one of the old wicker chairs, a mug of tea warm in my hands. The spring air carried the faint scent of lilacs from the yard, and for a few moments I let myself enjoy the quiet. I didn't hear Linda Foster until her sandals scuffed against the steps. She was my neighbor for over 20 years, a woman who never came by without a reason. Morning Eleanor, she called her sun hat, tipping slightly as she climbed onto the porch. "Morning, Linda," I replied, forcing a smile. "Come sit, I'll get you some tea." She waved her hand. "I won't stay long," but she lowered herself into the chair beside me anyway, her sunglasses sliding down her nose as she leaned closer. I knew that posture. It meant something was on her mind. For a while we just sipped in silence, the neighborhood sounds filling the air. Distant lawn mowers, a dog barking 2 streets over. Then Linda cleared her throat. "I saw something the other day," she began carefully. I turned slightly, my mug pausing near my lips. "Oh." Her eyes darted toward the street, then back to me. I was downtown near the Crescent Hotel. I spotted Madison in the parking lot. I stiffened. "Madison." She nodded. "Yes." And she wasn't alone. The words landed heavy between us. I set my mug down slowly, my fingers tightening on the handle. Who was she with? A man, not Daniel. Linda's voice lowered, almost a whisper. Tall, dark hair, sharp suit. Looked like money. They were standing close. Too close for it to be innocent. The porch suddenly felt smaller, the air warmer. I kept my voice even steady. "Are you sure it was her?" Linda's brow arched, her mouth drawing into a line. "Eleanor, I may be old, but I'm not blind. It was Madison. I even recognized that blue scarf she always wears. They were laughing about something standing close like teenagers. I thought you should know." I nodded, my throat dry. Inside my chest squeezed so tightly I could hardly breathe. Outwardly, I managed a quiet, "Thank you." She studied me for a moment, maybe expecting an outburst, maybe waiting for me to ask more questions. When I didn't, she patted my hand lightly. "I'll let you sit with it. Just keep your eyes open, Eleanor." She rose, adjusted her hat, and made her way down the steps. I stayed there, frozen, staring at the steam curling up from my mug. My pulse throbbed in my ears. Madison. With another man. The image conjured itself too vividly. Her laugh, that tilt of her head, the way she touched her stomach whenever she wanted sympathy. I imagined her giving those same looks to someone who wasn't my son. The ache in my chest shifted to something sharper, darker. I thought of Daniel so wrapped up in her every word, believing every excuse she fed him. He was fighting me over inheritance, over the life his father and I had built, while the woman he trusted was out parading with someone else. I wanted to march inside, demand answers, shake Daniel until he saw what I saw, but I stayed seated, my fingers trembling against the porcelain mug. If Linda was right, and I believed she was, then I needed proof. Words alone would never be enough. Daniel had chosen to believe Madison over me once. He would do it again. I forced a long, slow breath, watching the shadows lengthen across the porch floorboards. Madison had already begun erasing me from this house, stripping away Richard's memory, boxing up my life. Now I saw another truth, one that twisted like a knife. She was building something else entirely, and Daniel was too blind to see. I lifted my tea, though it had gone cold, and swallowed against the bitterness that coated my mouth. From that moment on, I told myself I would pay closer attention, not just to the photographs disappearing from the walls, but to Madison's footsteps when she left the house, to the phone calls she ended abruptly, to the way her smile lingered a little too long after Daniel turned away. The porch light flickered on as evening crept in. I sat in the quiet tea, untouched my hands, steadying at last. Whatever truth was waiting in the shadows, I was going to find it. And when I did, I wouldn't let them pretend it wasn't there. I had gotten into the habit of lying awake at night, listening to the sounds of the house. Some nights it was just the old pipes humming or the floorboards shifting with the spring air. But that night, as I sat up in bed with the lamp off, I heard voices drifting down the hall. Low, careful, not meant for me. I slipped on my robe and padded to the doorway, stopping just before the hallway opened into the living room. The glow of a single lamp spilled across the carpet, and their voices carried through it. Daniel's tone was tight, but not angry, like a man wrestling with something he had already decided. "So what are we supposed to do, Madison? She won't sign anything. She just shuts it down." Madison's reply was quiet, but sharp, every word like the slice of a knife. "Then we keep pushing. She's old Daniel. She doesn't need to be in control of all this anymore. You're her son. It makes sense for you to take over. Once the inheritance is in your name, we can move forward without all this tension." I felt my breath catch. My hands trembled against the doorframe. Daniel sighed a weary sound that still carried agreement. "And if she keeps saying no..." There was a pause, then Madison's voice again, colder this time. "Then we make other arrangements. There are places, senior living facilities, nursing homes, that would be better for her. She'd be looked after, and we'd have the freedom to raise this baby without her shadow over everything. It would be best for everyone." My heart slammed against my ribs. Daniel didn't protest. He didn't even hesitate. He muttered, "Maybe you're right. Maybe that's what we'll have to do." The words ripped through me. I pressed a hand to my mouth to keep from making a sound, the tears already burning hot against my eyes. Then Madison, again her voice softening into that syrupy sweetness she used so well. "It's not cruel, Daniel. It's practical. She's had her life. This is about ours now. About the baby. Once everything is transferred, she won't be a burden anymore." The word stuck. Burden. My son's wife was calling me a burden, and my son was agreeing. I couldn't listen any longer. I backed away, slowly, careful not to let the floor creak. In the dark of my room, I closed the door and leaned against it, pressing both hands flat against the wood. The tears came fast, then spilling down my face in silence. I sat on the edge of my bed, clutching the photograph of Richard from the nightstand. His smile in the picture blurred through my tears. "They're planning to put me away," I whispered, as if he could hear me from wherever he was. "Your son. Our son." I thought of the years, late nights, waiting up for Daniel, the scraped knees. I kissed the graduations, the dinners cooked when money was tight. All of it, every sacrifice, so he could grow into a man who now sat in the next room calmly discussing how to strip me of everything Richard and I had built. The betrayal pressed heavy on my chest until I couldn't breathe. I curled onto the bed, pulling the quilt over me, muffling my sobs so they wouldn't hear. At some point, I heard the murmur of voices fade, the lamp click off, and the creak of their bedroom door closing. The house went quiet again, but it was no longer the silence of peace. It was the silence of knowing, of realizing that the blood bond I had trusted was no longer strong enough to protect me. I lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, the word burden echoing in my head. By the time the first light touched the window, something inside me had shifted. The tears had dried, leaving only a hollow ache and a hard edge beneath it. They wanted me gone. They wanted what was mine. And now I knew exactly how far they were willing to go. The morning air was sharp as I pulled my car onto Interstate 94, heading toward downtown Minneapolis. I hadn't slept more than a few hours, but adrenaline kept me alert. The traffic hummed around me, taillights glowing in the gray light of early day. I gripped the steering wheel tighter than I needed to, replaying Daniel's voice in my mind, that calm acceptance of Madison's plan to ship me off like a box of clutter. I parked in a lot 2 blocks from the office building and walked the rest of the way. My feet felt heavy, as though each step carried the weight of decades of trust and love now splintered. The brass letters on the door read, "Grant and Keller, LLP. I steadied myself, drew a deep breath, and stepped inside. The receptionist greeted me politely, took my name, and within minutes I was ushered into a quiet office paneled in oak. The smell of polished wood and leather-bound books filled the air. Behind the desk sat Michael Grant, a man in his mid-50s with silver at his temples and sharp, assessing eyes. He rose, shook my hand firmly, and gestured to the chair across from him. "Mrs. Hayes," he said warmly, "I'm glad you came in." I settled into the leather chair, my purse resting on my lap like a shield. I wasn't sure I should. But after what I overheard last night, I couldn't stay quiet. He nodded as though he had heard it all before, then slid a manila folder across the desk toward me. "I reviewed the documents you emailed last week. The deed, the bank statements, your husband's will. Everything is very clear. All assets. Your home. The retirement accounts. Richard Hayes's life insurance payout are in your name alone. No joint ownership, no liens, no obligations. Legally. Eleanor, you are fully protected." The words should have felt like a balm, but instead they made my throat tighten. "So they can't just take it?" "No," he said firmly. "They have no legal claim. Your son may try to pressure you, but without your signature, nothing can be transferred." He leaned forward, folding his hands. "That doesn't mean they won't try other tactics. I've seen families forge signatures, file false claims, even attempt to declare a parent unfit. It's ugly, but it happens." I felt my stomach sink. "Daniel wouldn't—" My voice cracked, and I stopped. I thought of him sitting with Madison, agreeing that sending me to a nursing home was practical. My hands twisted the strap of my purse. He might. Michael watched me closely. "That's why you need to keep detailed records. Document every conversation, every attempt to push you. If you notice documents missing from your files, let me know immediately. And Eleanor, don't sign anything, no matter how harmless it looks." I nodded, tears pricking my eyes, though I forced them back. I reached out and touched the folder he'd given me. Inside were crisp copies of everything: the will with Richard's familiar signature, the deed to the house account statements showing my name alone. Seeing it in black and white gave me a fragile sense of ground under my feet. "This house," I whispered almost to myself. "Richard and I bought it in 1995. He always said it was our anchor. Now they talk like it's theirs." Michael's voice softened. "It's not. It never was. And it won't be unless you give it away. You hold the cards here. I let the words settle my fingers, tracing the edge of Richard's signature on the copy of the will. For months, I had felt pushed to the edges of my own life, erased from the walls, stripped from the mantle. Now, in this quiet office surrounded by papers that bore my name, I felt a sliver of myself return. But alongside the relief was a new understanding. Daniel and Madison wouldn't stop because I said no. They believed persistence would wear me down, and maybe, just maybe, they were right. If I didn't learn how to fight quietly, carefully, on my own terms. Michael leaned back. You don't have to decide anything drastic today. My advice: stay calm, keep records, and don't confront them head-on until you're ready. The law is on your side, but family dynamics, they can get messy. I managed a small smile. Messy is a polite word for it. He returned the smile, then grew serious again. You've spent your life taking care of others, Mrs. Hayes. It's time you take care of yourself. Don't let guilt or pressure undo the protections your husband worked so hard to leave you. I left the office with the folder tucked under my arm, the cold air of the street biting my cheeks. The cars rushed past strangers hurrying about their lives, none of them knowing that inside my purse was the proof of everything I owned, everything I had to lose. By the time I reached my car, I felt lighter and heavier all at once. Lighter because I had certainty. He couldn't take what wasn't his. He couldn't erase me with a single stroke of a pen. But heavier because I knew now. This wasn't going to end with a single no. Daniel and Madison would keep pressing, and I would have to be ready when they did. I sat behind the wheel for a long moment before starting the engine, the folder resting on the passenger seat like a silent ally. As I turned the key and pulled out of the lot, the city skyline glinting in the distance, I whispered to myself, "Be careful. Be smart." It was no longer just about protecting the inheritance. It was about protecting myself. The late afternoon sun slanted low as I carried a basket of produce through the aisles of Lunds and Byerly's on Hennepin Avenue. I had gone into the city for a few things. Bread, apples, a roast for Sunday. And the air outside was warm enough to make me linger on the sidewalk before heading back to the car. The grocery bags cut into my hands as I stepped toward the crosswalk waiting for the light to change. That was when I saw her. Madison stood across the street, her blue scarf fluttering in the breeze, the one Linda had mentioned. She wasn't alone. At first I thought I must be mistaken. The man beside her was taller than Daniel, broad-shouldered, his dark hair neatly trimmed. His suit looked expensive, tailored, the kind of thing you didn't wear for errands. Madison's arm looped through his, their bodies close enough that there was no mistaking the intimacy. They paused at the entrance of the Nicolette, a restaurant known for its white tablecloths and hefty prices. He leaned down, whispered something near her ear. She tilted her head back, laughing that lilting laugh I hadn't heard once in my house. His hand slipped naturally into hers, and they pushed through the door together. My stomach lurched. The grocery bags slid lower in my hands until I nearly dropped them. I forced myself to step behind a row of parked cars, my heart hammering against my ribs. Linda's words echoed like a drumbeat. I saw her with a man in a suit. They were laughing, standing too close. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers clumsy. The camera app opened, and I raised it just high enough above the roof of the car to snap a picture before the door closed behind them. My hands shook so badly the first shot blurred. I steadied myself, pressed again, and caught a clean frame. Madison's face lit with a smile, her hand threaded tightly through the stranger's. His watch glinting under the street lamp. I lowered the phone, my breaths shallow. My knees felt weak, as though they might give out right there on the sidewalk. I wanted to turn away to pretend I hadn't seen it, but the images burned into me undeniable. This wasn't stress relief, wasn't a friendly lunch. It was something else. Something Daniel couldn't even imagine. I sank onto a bench near the bus stop, the grocery bags at my feet, my phone still in my hand. Sightened. For a long moment I just stared at the screen, the frozen smile on Madison's face. Anger surged hot in my chest, colliding with grief so strong it stole my breath. She was using Daniel, using his trust, using his child, or the child he thought was his, while she laughed in the arms of another man. I thought of my son, the way he had looked at me when he told me I was causing stress, the way he repeated Madison's words as if they were gospel. He was fighting me for money, for control, believing he was building a family, and all the while his wife was already building another life without him. I pressed the phone to my chest, closing my eyes. "Oh, Daniel," I whispered, though no one could hear. "What have you gotten yourself into?" When the restaurant door swung open again, I snapped another photo. The man, later I would learn his name was Ethan Carter, guided Madison inside with a hand at the small of her back so familiar it made my stomach turn. I gathered my groceries, walking quickly to my car. Each step felt heavy, the air thick in my throat. I drove home with the radio off, the city rushing by in a blur of headlights and stoplights. My mind replayed the scene again and again, the scarf, the laugh, the clasp of hands. At home, I laid the photos out on my kitchen table, the screen glowing in the dim light. I zoomed in, studying every detail as if proof mattered when my heart already knew the truth. The ache of betrayal wasn't mine this time. It was Daniel's. He just didn't know it yet. I wiped at my eyes, the tears hot and angry. I wasn't crying for Madison, not even for myself. I was crying for my son, for the blindness that left him defending a woman who was smiling up at another man. I slipped the phone back into my purse, locking it with a code only I knew. The images were saved, backed up, hidden where no one could erase them. That night, as I sat by the window with the lights off, I watched Daniel pull into the driveway carrying takeout Madison had no doubt requested. He kissed her cheek at the door, smiling faintly weary from work. She took the bags, her hand resting on her belly as if she were the picture of innocence. I turned away. My fingers curled tight around the arm of my chair. The photos weighed heavy in my purse, proof that Linda had been right all along. Proof that Madison wasn't just a manipulator. She was a liar. And now I had the evidence to prove it. The distance between us grew so slowly at first I thought I was imagining it. Daniel started coming home later, eating meals with his phone in his hand. His answers clipped when I asked about his day. If I lingered too long in the kitchen while Madison cooked, he would clear his throat, shifting as if my presence were an inconvenience. One evening, I set down a plate of roasted chicken, trying to bridge the silence. "I made enough for everyone," I said, placing the dish in the center of the table. Madison looked up from her seat, her smile tight. "That's sweet, Eleanor, but the doctor told me to avoid certain seasonings. I'll just fix myself something lighter." Daniel glanced at her and nodded, then looked back at me. "Mom, you know she needs less stress. That includes food that's easy on her system." I sat down slowly, my fork heavy in my hand. "Cooking for family isn't stress," I said softly. "It's love." His jaw tightened. He didn't argue further, but the air around us stiffened like ice. The words came sharper a few nights later. I had just finished a call with my sister when Daniel came into the living room. His shoulders were tense, his voice too calm. "Mom, you've got to stop calling people so late in the morning. Madison needs rest. She said she hears you pacing, moving around, making noise. It's stressing her out." I stared at him, my chest tightening. Stress. I've worked 30 years in an emergency room. I know what stress is. Talking to my sister at 10 o'clock in the morning isn't stress. She's pregnant. He shot back, his tone flat. "It's different. You don't get it." The words struck like a slap. I swallowed hard, fighting to keep my composure. "So now I'm the problem. I'm the one hurting her." Daniel hesitated for half a second, then nodded. "Yeah. You need to give her space. For the baby. For the baby. Always the baby." Every sentence Madison crafted, every excuse Daniel repeated, ended with those words. I felt my throat close, my breath shallow. The boy I had raised. The man who once called me for advice on everything from jobs to heartbreak, now stood there accusing me of being a danger to his unborn child. I looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for something familiar. I wanted to see the kindness, I knew the gratitude, the loyalty. Instead, I saw only weariness, frustration, and a wall that Madison had built brick by brick between us. The words escaped before I could stop them. "Daniel, are you sure the baby is yours?" The silence that followed was deafening. His eyes widened, his mouth opening just slightly, then snapping shut. His face flushed red, his fists curling at his sides. What the hell is that supposed to mean? He demanded, his voice rising for the first time. I held his gaze steady even as my heart raced. "It means what I asked. Are you sure?" He shook his head, his voice trembling with fury. "I can't believe you'd say that. That's disgusting." "She's my wife. Of course it's mine." I didn't flinch. "I hope so," I said quietly. "But hope isn't certainty." He stared at me, his breath coming fast like a man cornered. Then without another word, he grabbed his keys from the counter and stormed toward the door. The slam rattled the windows, leaving a hollow echo in the hallway. I sank into the chair by the window, the house around me suddenly vast and empty. The night pressed close against the glass, and I sat there listening to the sound of my own heartbeat. For years I had thought no matter how far life pulled us apart, Daniel and I would always find our way back to each other. But now, in the silence he left behind, I knew something had shifted beyond repair. The words I had spoken couldn't be unsaid, and the truth behind them couldn't be ignored. The distance between us wasn't measured in miles anymore. It was colder, sharper, carved into the air between mother and son. And for the first time, I feared he might never cross it again. The dining room table gleamed under the soft light of the chandelier, the new bulbs casting a harsh white glow instead of the warm amber I'd always preferred. Madison had set the table earlier in the day, arranging candles and silverware with the kind of precision meant to impress. By the time the guests arrived, 2 of Daniel's co-workers and their wives, the air already buzzed with forced laughter and the faint aroma of pot roast. I took my usual seat at the end of the table, quietly folding my napkin into my lap. Daniel poured wine for everyone but me, asking if I wanted iced tea instead. His tone was polite but distracted, his smile thin. The conversation started harmlessly enough. Projects at the office, the new development in St. Paul, someone's vacation to Arizona. Madison floated between topics with practiced ease, one hand brushing her belly every few minutes, reminding everyone of her condition. The women asked her questions, cooed about the nursery colors, and Madison answered with that polished charm that had always unsettled me. But it was her next words that froze the air. She gestured broadly toward the room, her smile wide. "It's been a lot of work, but it's finally coming together. This house is really starting to feel like ours, and soon it'll officially belong to our family." The words landed heavy. For a moment, no one spoke. A fork clinked against a plate, too loud in the silence. My hands tightened around my napkin. I looked straight at her, then slowly shifted my gaze to Daniel. His eyes dropped to his plate, the muscles in his jaw working. I placed my fork down carefully, letting the weight of the moment linger before I spoke. "This house," I said evenly, my voice carrying in the quiet room, "has belonged to me since 1995. Richard and I bought it together, paid every bill, every mortgage payment, and it will stay mine. That isn't going to change." The air snapped like a rubber band pulled too far. One of Daniel's co-workers cleared his throat. His wife shifted uncomfortably in her chair. The guests looked at each other, then back at their plates, their smiles faltering. Madison's face froze, her polite smile cracking just slightly. She let out a short laugh, high-pitched and brittle. "Of course, Eleanor. I didn't mean anything by it. It feels like a family home now, that's all." But the damage was done. The words lingered like smoke, undeniable and sour. I leaned back, picking up my glass of iced tea, and took a slow sip. Family home or not, there's a difference between living in a house and owning it. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Even the candle flames seemed to waver. Daniel shifted in his chair, finally looking up at me, his expression tight with something between anger and shame. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, clearly at a loss for words. The conversation limped on after that, forced and thin. One of the wives asked about a new restaurant opening downtown. Madison answered too brightly, her voice wobbling around the edges. Daniel tried to pick up the slack, but his words fell flat. I sat quietly, letting them scramble my plate half-finished. Inside, my heart pounded, but my face stayed calm. It wasn't rage that steadied me. It was clarity. I had spent months being erased from my own home, from my own son's life, but in that moment with strangers watching, I had pulled myself back into the center. By the time dessert was served, a pie Madison had bought from the store and presented as homemade, the tension hadn't eased. The guests picked at their slices, exchanged glances, and murmured polite goodbyes earlier than expected. When the front door closed behind the last couple, the house fell quiet, except for the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Madison gathered plates with clipped movements, her smile gone, her lips pressed tight. Daniel stood by the window, his hands in his pockets, staring out into the night. I rose from my chair, folded my napkin, and placed it neatly on the table. My voice was calm as I spoke into the silence. The next time you want to speak about this house as if it belongs to you, remember what I said tonight. Neither of them answered. Madison's shoulders stiffened as she carried dishes into the kitchen. Daniel remained still, his back to me. I walked slowly down the hallway to my room, my footsteps echoing softly against the hardwood floor. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of strength return, though the ache of betrayal hadn't dulled. In the quiet of my room, I closed the door and pressed my palms against the cool wood. I let myself breathe steady and deep. Tonight hadn't solved anything, but it had made one thing certain: they couldn't erase me with polite words and painted smiles, not anymore. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the clatter of dishes had faded from the kitchen, I found Daniel alone in the living room. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator in the distance. Madison had gone upstairs early, muttering something about needing rest, her heels clicking sharp against the steps before silence swallowed her retreat. Daniel sat on the edge of the couch, his shoulders hunched, the glow of his phone lighting his face. I carried a large flat envelope with me, the one I had kept locked away in my desk drawer. My steps were steady as I crossed the room and laid it down on the coffee table in front of him. He looked up, brows furrowing. "What's this?" I lowered myself into the chair opposite him, folding my hands in my lap. "Open it." He hesitated before sliding the papers out. The crisp sound of legal documents filled the air as he unfolded the first page. His eyes scanned the bold title, Deed of Ownership, and there, clear as day, was my name. He flipped to the next, Retirement Account Statement, my name again. The will Richard had signed years earlier, leaving everything solely to me. My name, my name, my name. The color drained slightly from his face as he flipped through the stack. I watched the way his jaw tightened, the muscle jumping as his eyes darted from line to line. His hands stilled on the last page, and he let out a slow breath. "So what are you trying to prove?" His voice was low, almost defensive. I leaned forward slightly. "That what you and Madison have been saying, what she's been planting in your head, it isn't true. This house, these accounts, your father's estate, none of it belongs to you. It belongs to me. And unless I decide otherwise, that's how it will stay." He set the papers down, rubbing his forehead. "You didn't have to make a spectacle of it in front of my friends tonight." "I didn't," I said evenly. "I simply corrected a lie. But here in private, I want you to see it with your own eyes. No rumors, no assumptions, just the truth in writing." He stared at me, his eyes darkening. "You think this changes anything? You think I don't already know your name is on those papers? That doesn't mean it's right. You're sitting on money on property while we're trying to raise a family. You could make things easier, Mom. Why won't you?" The words struck hard, but I forced my voice to stay calm. "Because it isn't yours to take. Because your father and I didn't work ourselves to the bone for 30 years so you could treat me like a bank account. We did it so I would be secure. So I wouldn't end up at the mercy of anyone. Even you." His eyes flicked away, staring at the shadows pooling in the corners of the room. For a moment, I thought I saw doubt flicker there, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "You don't understand," he muttered. "Madison's right. This house, it should be for the baby, for our future. You shouldn't be hanging onto it like some trophy." My chest tightened, but I kept my tone steady. "This house isn't a trophy. It's my life. It's every memory, every sacrifice, every promise your father made me. And I won't let it be rewritten just because it suits Madison's story." He pressed his palms against his knees, leaning forward, his voice rising. "So you'd rather hold on to everything and watch us struggle? You'd rather let your grandchild grow up without stability just so you can sit here surrounded by ghosts?" The sting of his words cut deep, but I forced myself not to flinch. I'd rather protect what's mine than hand it over to someone who doesn't respect me. If you want stability for your child, Daniel, then build it yourself. That's what your father did. The silence between us grew thick, heavy. He pushed back against the couch, running both hands over his face. I watched him waiting, hoping for something. Remorse, recognition, even a flicker of the boy I once knew. But all I saw was frustration simmering into something harder. Finally, he stood gathering the papers back into the envelope and shoving it onto the table. "Fine, you've made your point, but don't expect me to agree with it." He turned toward the stairs, his shoulders rigid, his steps heavy against the wood. I sat back in my chair, the envelope lying untouched on the table between us, like a wall neither of us could cross. Upstairs, I heard Madison's voice, low and questioning, then his muffled reply. A door clicked shut. Alone in the living room, I reached for the papers, sliding them back into order, my fingers smoothing the creases he had left behind. My name shone back at me from every line, every page, proof undeniable, but instead of comfort, it left me with a hollow ache. Because the truth was clear now, no matter what the documents said, no matter how firmly the law stood on my side. Daniel's heart was drifting farther away. And that loss, heavier than any piece of paper, pressed down on me until I could hardly breathe. For the next week, the house settled into a rhythm of silence. Daniel barely spoke to me unless Madison prompted him, and when he did, his words were clipped practical, void of warmth. He avoided my eyes, moving through rooms like I was little more than furniture. At dinner, he answered Madison's questions, laughed softly at her remarks, but never once turned to me. I remembered Michael Grant's words in his oak-paneled office. "Sometimes the best victory is leaving with your dignity intact." The sentence had seemed abstract then, a bit of lawyerly advice meant to keep me cautious. But now, sitting in the house that no longer felt like mine, it rang like a bell I could no longer ignore. On a Wednesday morning, while Madison slept late upstairs and Daniel had already gone to work, I opened the closet in my bedroom and began packing. I didn't move quickly or in secret. There was no need for theatrics. I folded my clothes neatly into 2 suitcases, setting aside only what mattered. The cedar chest Richard had built stayed where it was. It was too heavy to carry, and in a way leaving it behind felt like proof of the emptiness that house had become. But the papers, the accounts, the deeds, all of that I gathered carefully into a leather satchel. Every page bore my name. Every number was proof of Richard's labor, my labor, our decades of saving. And all of it would go with me. As I packed, my hand lingered on a framed photograph of Richard holding Daniel as a toddler, both of them grinning at the camera. I traced the glass with my fingertip, my chest tightening. For a moment, I nearly set it back down, but then I slid it into the suitcase between sweaters. This memory, at least, I would not leave for Madison to box away. By afternoon, I had called a realtor friend who managed rentals in downtown Minneapolis. Within an hour, she told me about a 1-bedroom apartment near Loring Park, small but clean with enough sunlight to make it feel open. I said yes without hesitation. I didn't need space. I needed peace. When Daniel returned that evening, my suitcases were already by the door. He paused in the entryway, his eyes narrowing. "What's this?" I stood by the table, my hands resting on the satchel that held every legal proof of my independence. "I'm moving out." He blinked, startled. What, Mom? This is ridiculous. You don't need to." "I do," I cut him off gently. "You've made it clear where your loyalty lies, and I refuse to stay where I'm not wanted." His mouth opened, then closed again. Behind him, Madison appeared at the top of the stairs, her hand resting on the banister, her expression unreadable. Daniel took a step forward, lowering his voice. "Mom, you can't just leave like this." "What will people think?" I looked at him steadily. "Let them think what they want. I'd rather leave with my dignity than wait for you two to decide when to push me out." His jaw tightened. For a moment I thought he might argue further, but he didn't. He only stepped aside, his hands buried deep in his pockets, his shoulders stiff. I wheeled the suitcases past him, the weight of each step heavy but certain. Madison didn't say a word as I crossed the threshold, though I felt her eyes follow me until the door shut behind me. The drive into the city was quiet, the headlights streaking past as dusk settled over Minneapolis. My chest ached with grief I hadn't yet allowed myself to feel. Grief for the boy. I had raised, grief for the home I had built, grief for the trust that had been broken beyond repair. But beneath the ache was something steadier, resolve. When I unlocked the apartment later that night, the place smelled faintly of fresh paint. The windows overlooked the park, the lights of the city twinkling beyond. I set my satchel on the counter, pulled Richard's photograph from my suitcase and placed it on the small kitchen table. The silence that filled the space was different, no longer hostile, no longer pressing. It was mine. I sat there a long time listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the muffled sound of traffic below. For the first time in months, I felt air in my lungs that didn't carry the weight of someone else's plans. I had left the house behind, and with it I had left the last illusion that my son would choose me over her. The first week in my new apartment passed quietly, the kind of quiet that didn't make my chest feel heavy. Maasamani. I unpacked slowly, one box at a time, careful not to rush. The rooms were smaller than the house I had left, but the sunlight through the wide windows filled every corner, making the place feel alive instead of empty. I placed Richard's photograph on the kitchen table next to a vase of fresh tulips I'd bought at the farmer's market. For the first time in months, I could breathe without feeling someone watching me. One morning I dialed a number I hadn't called in years. Cynthia Peterson picked up on the second ring, her voice warm, familiar. She and I had volunteered together at a women's shelter back in the late 90s before life got too busy. "Eleanor," she said, her tone laced with surprise. "Hi, Cynthia," I replied, a smile tugging at my lips. "I was wondering if you still work with those transitional programs, the ones for women who need a safe place to stay." Her voice brightened immediately. "Every day. Why do you ask?" I looked around my apartment at the spare bedroom down the hall with nothing in it but a bed and a dresser. "Because I think I might be able to help. I've got the space and I've got the means. Maybe it's time I use it." Within a week, Cynthia had connected me with a young woman named Sarah Mitchell. She was 24 with tired eyes that held too much weight for someone her age. She carried her 3-year-old son Tommy on her hip when they came to meet me. He clutched a worn stuffed rabbit, his big brown eyes peeking shyly from behind her shoulder. "Thank you for this," Sarah murmured as she stepped inside. We needed somewhere safe." I showed them the bedroom, freshly painted in a soft cream with a quilt folded neatly at the foot of the bed. I had tucked a small basket of toys in the corner. Block's a toy truck, and a set of picture books I'd found at a thrift shop. Tommy's eyes lit up as he reached for the truck, his laughter echoing through the apartment like music I hadn't realized I'd been missing. That night, I lay in my bed, listening to the muffled sound of Sarah reading to her son. Her voice was steady, tender. I closed my eyes and let the sound wash over me. My apartment no longer felt like a retreat. It felt like it had a purpose. Over the next few weeks, Sarah began to find her footing. She applied for jobs during the day while I watched Tommy. He would sit at the kitchen table coloring while I prepared dinner, his little hands smudging the paper with bright crayons. Sometimes he would laugh so hard he'd fall right off his chair and I'd scoop him up laughing too. It was during one of those dinners that Sarah looked at me across the table. Her fork paused mid-air. "I didn't think I'd ever feel safe in someone else's home again," she said quietly. I reached across the table, covering her hand with mine. "You don't have to thank me. You're giving me something too." And it was true. For every piece of my heart that Madison had tried to erase, for every cold word Daniel had thrown at me, Tommy's laughter and Sarah's resilience filled the cracks. I hadn't just left a house. I had stepped into a life I hadn't known was waiting. News of Daniel reached me in fragments. An overheard comment from a mutual friend at church, a brief message from a neighbor who still lived on our old street. Madison had left. One day she packed her things, the nursery she had fussed over abandoned, and moved in with the man I'd once seen her hand in hand with downtown. Ethan Carter, the businessman with the sharp suit. She hadn't looked back. Daniel. I heard stayed in the house alone, his marriage in ruins, his savings drained from trying to please her. Whatever plans he and Madison had spun about inheritance were ashes now. He had lost her, lost the future he thought he was securing. And though the house still stood, it was emptier than ever. I didn't gloat. I didn't even feel satisfaction the way I thought I might. What I felt was something steadier confirmation. The choice I had made to walk away with my dignity and my inheritance intact was the right one. Karma had done what it always does. It leveled the ground. One bright morning, sunlight spilling across the hardwood floor, Tommy barreled into the living room, clutching his toy rabbit, his giggles bouncing off the walls. Sarah followed her face, more relaxed than I'd ever seen it. I leaned against the doorway, watching them, a warmth spreading through me I hadn't felt in years. Richard had left me the means to be safe. Now, in a way, I was passing that safety on piece by piece to someone else. The house I had left behind was no longer my anchor. This small apartment filled with light and laughter, was home. If this story made you think about the quiet strength of mothers and how we find ways to rise, even when we're pushed down, stay with me here. There are more stories like mine, more reminders that dignity and resilience are never truly erased.